So today we are celebrating the Buddha's enlightenment. And most of you will know that Buddha Day is one of the three main festivals we celebrate in Triratna all around the world. We celebrate one for each of the three jewels. So we have Buddha Day, Dharma Day, and Sangha Day. And on this day in Triratna, we celebrate the Buddha's enlightenment, his awakening, his perfection of wisdom and compassion. Buddhists around the world may be doing different things around this time. Some of them are celebrating his enlightenment. Some of them are celebrating his birth, enlightenment, and death, his passing away. It varies enormously. And it's quite an interesting discussion to have sometimes if you try to decide which moment of his life is the most significant. Was it more significant that he was enlightened, or was it more significant that he was born at all? Or is it more significant that he passed away and was not reborn? That's another big discussion. But here today we have Gunaketu from Stockholm, and we have Prasadacarin Gunaketu from Oslo, chair of Oslo, and Prasadacarin, our chair here in Stockholm. And they have agreed to have a conversation, or maybe it's a sort of interview, I'm not sure really, but I wanted to ask you both first, when you think about the Buddha's life story, whether you have a moment in his life that has always seemed most important or most inspiring for you personally in your practice, or most relevant to your life, particularly when you first came along perhaps to a Buddhist center. I wonder, maybe Prasadacarin, would you like to answer first?
It's hard to pick one because his life is full of magical, inspiring moments. I think, though, the moment, or the time after the Buddha's awakening, when he has this vision of the lotus lake, is a reoccurring one that I find very inspiring. That, after hesitating about whether anyone else apart from him would be able to comprehend, understand, and put into practice what he had realized, then eventually deciding that, based on that vision of these lotuses in different stages of development, some in the mud, some in the water, some a bud, some flowering, fully, and so on. And that being a vision for humanity. I think that's a reoccurring one for me. That is close to his awakening as well, accidentally.
Do you identify more as one of as a teacher? So wondering whether it's worth teaching the Dharma, and can people really take this in, how to make it available? Or do you identify more as one of the lotuses in the mud?
I think when that image comes to my mind, it's usually in relationship to all beings. So it's more me being one of all those beings, and all beings being, the same. We're all lotuses somewhere between mud and, beauty.
I guess also you're both, aren't you? You're a Dharma teacher and a lotus somewhere up in the water. Maybe not in the mud.
Hopefully.
Yeah. How about you, Gunaketu?
Well, again, there's lots of moments, but when you asked the question, the moment that came to mind was Siddhartha leaving home, leaving the comforts and the well-known, and based on this hunch, having seen this wandering holy man, somehow sensing there is something beyond, and then just leaving everything behind, going forth. Yeah, and I could, it moved me early on, and it really moves me now just thinking about it.
What did you do as a result of being so moved by that? What effect did it have in your life?
Well, I think at one point, maybe the closest was to just leave academia, the PhD that I've started, and just join what was supposed to be a shop team in Manchester that turned into the building team, and move into the men's community. Although the comparison is fault in many ways, but it was one of the most important choices in my life, I think.
And of course, we should just say I knew Gunaketu in Manchester many years ago, from the late 90s, and something you may not know about him is that he learnt how to build the central heating system and all the plumbing and water for the Manchester Buddhist Centre. That's a very tall building, 7 floors of 19th century warehouse that needed new piping and central heating. Maybe you could tell us a bit about how this myth inspired you. I've seen photographs of you in a welder's helmet.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't a welder's helmet, it was a sandblasting kit.
Okay.
Sandblast all these bricks. But I think there's 2 aspects to it. One is also, again, kind of going forth and kind of transforming this old building into something like a beautiful building Buddhist center, and at the same time transforming me, because then I had been engaged for a few years, and I've come asked for ordination. I was kind of really throwing myself into that. So, blasting these bricks with sand, I was kind of trying to blast my own bad habits. But and then there was also this working with brick and water and metal, and just coming from academia and all these words, all this, and then actually being working with the elements in the really raw form, and honing the skill to make it hold together. It's like the first time I was trying to put water in my first heating system on the ground, on the first floor. It's just leaking everywhere. And then at the last heating system at the top floor, and it didn't leak at all. So it's just this kind of a metaphor of change, and this, which so that's inspiring. Yeah.
Thank you. And Prasadacarin, does I'm just wondering, before you became chair of the Buddhist Centre, you used to be an undertaker, a begravnings. What? I don't know what that is in Swedish. Something. Does anything in the Buddha's life relate to your work as in working in a funeral directors?
Yep. Actually, there are different things in my life that ended up leading to me deciding to become an undertaker, but from the dharmic point of view, I guess there's a general kind of emphasis of remembering to reflect on the fact that you and everyone else will die. But more specifically than that, I remember when I realized that I could train to become an undertaker, I remember thinking, okay, so the Buddha encouraged his disciples to go to the cremation grounds and cemeteries and sit, among what was left of people, basically, in different, stages of decomposition and all the rest of it, and basically just take impermanence in properly. And then I realized that in the north, up here, it's all nice and neat and tidy, or hidden in terms of, seeing death. So I thought, okay, if I become an undertaker, I will be able to be in crematoriums, and I will be in morgues, and I will actually face death, literally. And I guess if your master says that that's a good thing, well, why not try?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we can think that the Dharma is something we do when we're not at work. We might fall into that, and actually it's really important, isn't it, to see that this is a life. This is what we're looking at in the Buddha's experience. This is a life, It can inform everything we do. Our specific topic today is the Buddha's enlightenment and Nordic myth. So just to say a bit about myth, in English, this word, I don't know if it does in Norwegian and Swedish, but in English, this has two meanings. So one is that, something that's not really true. Oh, that's a myth. That's just made up. But another meaning is that it's a story which has meaning for our lives, has symbolic meaning for our lives. And Bhante always talked about the fact that there were two kinds of truth. So people sometimes dismiss the Buddha's life story as probably just a myth. But he said there were two kinds of truth. There's historical truth, which is sort of like facts and dates and evidence. But then there's mythic truth. It's true in a deeper way. It's true for our lives. So, for example, the story of the four sights. The story is always that the Buddha, as a young man, Siddhartha had never actually seen a dead body, had never experienced suffering or unsatisfactoriness or sickness. And then he went out into the town and saw these four people who were suffering, and was completely shocked because it was for the first time. Now, obviously, I don't think that we should necessarily take that as literal historical factual truth, but it has a lot of meaning at a mythic level. So this is what we're really interested in here, is how is the Buddha's life experience meaningful for us in a much deeper way as fellow humans, just like he was. And then we come on to the Nordic part of it. So, I'm from Britain. I come from London. And in Britain, we have a rather romantic idea about the idea of North, and particularly about Nordic countries. We might know a bit about trolls, but mainly British people, the myth they have about Sweden, particularly Sweden, is that it's about perfect storage arrangements from IKEA. So the myth there is that if you could only get your household storage just perfect, there won't be any more suffering and dukkha. Okay. We also know about Volvo and smorgasbord and ABBA. Actually, I'm totally ignorant about Nordic culture and history, and so are most British people, I'm sorry to say. So what I'd be really interested to hear is from you two, is what it is in Nordic culture that links up with the Buddha's life story. We need to find ways of linking the Dharma and our Dharmic myths to our own cultures. So what is there? I don't quite know how to phrase this, but what is there in your history and culture as Nordic people, two Nordic men, that inspires your Dharma practice? I don't know which of you would like to speak first, but imagine this is a quiz and you press your buzzers.
Oh, the press, what?
Bang.
Well, as you speak, instead I want a preamble, because one of the things that I got a bit disenchanted with when I moved to Norway in 2000 after 11 years of living in Manchester, as you said, Munisha. I moved back full-time in 2001, with a preview in 2000. And I came all inspired, back to my roots and this culture and this myth that we're going to explore. And after a few years, I was a bit disappointed that very few Norwegians seemed to be interested. And so it seemed as though this is a bit dead, or much more dead than I had anticipated. And when kind of listening again, if you like, to what is this? And somehow I don't know why or how, but I was led on to this idea that the stories of the big God, they, to most people, it died a long time ago. but the small gods, the myth of small trolls and gnomes and spirits of the forest, and they kept on living. And I had the sense that my grandmother, and she, during the war, Second World War, she had built a little cottage out in this village where Hans and Eva are, you know, sitting in right now. There was this sense that she was a bit in touch. She was a bit afraid, and she was a bit kind of aligned with these other spirits. And so she would occasionally threaten Munisha Devi and me when we were kids. If we weren't listening, you know, something bad could happen connected to these beings. And although it's kind of thin, I thought that's where I felt in my own life the kind of the strongest connection. And I do think it is important, and it connects me into the stories we have the Buddhist texts about all these devas, and in a sense the pantheistic aspect of the Buddhist worldview, and I think that is an important, and I see the significance of that more and more today as I'm struggling to really live sustainably and inspire the world to live sustainably. This kind of really, you know, reconnecting with the world as not with a human being at the center, but just beingness and consciousness at the center. So that's the kind of that's a low level, low resolution, or, you know, connection that I find now I find very inspiring. But I think from very early on, I think it's the myth of Odin that for a long time, you know, has been one of my driving myths in a sense. And of the very many stories of Odin, when thinking about this, I think the story where he in search of wisdom and to find out what does this world really mean, what's the significance of this world, he takes his one eye and deposits it in the well of wisdom of the Meme. And with that, then he can see both with his fleshly eye, and he can see kind of beyond space and time with his wisdom eye. And so I think that is what I am trying to do as a Buddhist practice. And I think, you know, reciting the Heart Sutra, you know, with a form and emptiness, it's kind of, I'm trying to see these both these aspects of life, and I have to give something up to do that. And in my life, I need to give up, you know, a lot of the things that I want, you know, all my ideas about how life should be. You know, I have to let go of that somehow.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you want to say something, Prasadacarin?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. You asked about Nordic culture, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, you know, because it's like, if it's Nordic mythology, then I have been thinking about that a bit. When it comes to like general Nordic or even Swedish culture, for me, that is a recurring question, especially Swedish culture. I don't know. I'm not sure I know what Swedish culture is, and I think it's partly because my background isn't Swedish, although I'm raised here. But also, it's interesting because I was born and raised here, so it's not, I'm swimming in it. So what is it actually? Yeah, maybe we need a seminar sometime, you know, what is Swedishness, and how does it impact on our Buddhist practice? But yeah, if I go to the more Nordic myth side of things, it's interesting that Gunaketu mentions the story of Odin and his eye, because I hardly knew anything about Nordic myth a few years ago. I've been more interested in the last few years. But when I was on my ordination course at Gunaketu in Spain 5 years ago, Arta Priya, who was also part of building that Manchester Buddhist Center, by the way, he was leading the course. And before a puja one evening, he mentioned that, you know, with insight, you can't get insight without letting go of something. You need to really sacrifice something. It won't come for free. And he mentioned Odin giving up his one eye to be able to, get the wisdom from the Mimer's Brunn. And I was completely blown away by that, up in the Spanish mountains studying Buddhism. But I think that was actually the opening for me. And since I have been reading up a bit more and been curious about Nordic mythology, so I think that's an interesting kind of dharmic parallel for me. And it's interesting also Gunaketu mentioning the Heart Sutra and form and emptiness, because one of the main things I'm inspired by when I look at Nordic mythology isn't necessarily the kind of characters so much so far, but like the kind of cosmological frame. So, Buddhism doesn't have a kind of clear, this is when the world started or anything, but Nordic mythology has. And it's quite interesting that like in the beginning, on the one side of whatever cosmos, there was fire, the land of fire, and on the other, there was the land of ice. And in between, there was nothing. Inget. There was nothing in between. And fire and ice met somehow in the nothing. And out of the nothing came everything. I think that's such an interesting kind of form and emptiness symbol as well. And then on the other end of the cosmology, you have Ragnarök, where like everyone, the gods, even the gods know that the world will just fall apart completely. And then something else, the world will come again. And I think that's interesting. Like, we don't need that cosmology as Buddhists necessarily, but at least the kind of the framework was that things have come from nothing and they will fall apart and rise again, depending on conditions, if you take a Buddhist kind of terminology to it. I think that's very interesting and inspiring.
It kind of relates to the idea of what eons, doesn't it? Kalpas in Buddhism, of involution and evolution, and also to in the esoteric Jewish tradition, you have the idea of God filling up everything, all the space there is, but having to make a little space in himself to create a space of nothingness in which to create. That's quite a common thing across different traditions, isn't it? Do you want to respond to that, Gunaketu?
Yeah, because I think I also find this mythology inspiring, and as you said, Prasadacarin, we don't need that cosmology because, in a sense, Buddha isn't so concerned where it all started and so forth. At the same time, I think we do need it, in particular as non-Buddhists. And I think that cosmology is a good alternative to the linear cosmology that I think dominates the world, in the sense that, it all either in the Christian, some idea, it started with Adam and Eve, and then it just carries on, and then it finishes with, when it all apocalypse or doomsday, or, with Big Bang, and then it just carries on until either ad infinitum, and it becomes better and better all the time, or we all die, end of story. And so therefore I also find interesting that, this calamity of Ragnarok, where, yes, as you say, nothing is sacred, yet life is sacred, in a sense, not sacred, but it carries on. And so, with our current state of the climate, I think, well, to me, that's just so in line with the way astronomy looks at the world. So somehow, it starts with the Big Bang, and obviously there's something before the Big Bang. And of course, sooner or later, humans will die. But the planet will carry on. And one day, the planet will implode or explode or something. And then something else will emerge. So just, it helps me with setting a frame that is just so much bigger and more, more circular and in line with, what I can see all around me. And to me, that kind of, I swear, it's a step towards maybe what Odin saw, letting go of his both worldly eyes.
For those of us who are not very knowledgeable about this, maybe you could explain what Ragnarök is. I don't want to assume that everybody knows. Or maybe it's just me. But...
Sharon, or shall I?
Give it a try.
Should I give it a try?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
So, well, I think you explained very well that, there's a myth of the beginning, of fire and ice, and then after that comes everything. And you have these forces in a sense of order and chaos. And in a sense, the classical god of Odin and Frey and Thor, and, they are representing the forces of order, although they're not very orderly often. And I think I like that as well, that they're not squeaky clean like a lot of mythologies. You're either completely pure or you're completely evil. Well, they're not, but they are relatively orderly. And then you have other beings, and you have the Jotnar, and you have the Vaner, and they are in various degrees representing chaos. And these form easy and uneasy alliances around the world, all the time. And they start wars, and then they kind of make peace. But eventually it'll build up to this massive war, against the forces of chaos, against the forces of order. And they meet at the battleground, and all the imaginable forces are let loose. And then in this battle, the forces of good and the forces of chaos are equally strong, and so they just destroy each other. And so the whole world is laid waste, except these few seeds of life that somehow survive, and out of that grows a new world. And the old saga says very little about this, but you have a sense of a fresh. It's almost like you after a really heavy winter, when the snow is smelting, and you could see the first buds as it were sticking up. There is that kind of freshness and happiness and joy, and life is back. And so I find that that's very inspiring, and that's very much part of the Ragnarok story to me.
I guess we can probably relate to that idea of the forces of chaos and the forces of order in our own lives, deeply symbolic in your own life. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. I was just thinking, several things you've said sort of bring in the idea of time and outside time. And one of the, I think, interesting things Bhante said about the Buddha's life was like that the Buddha is an eruption within time of something timeless. So if we see time as horizontal, say, linear time, but the Buddha's enlightenment particularly is a moment of where this is intersected by timelessness. This is a quite difficult thing to explain in a few minutes, but in fact, we don't have to understand it. We could just reflect on it. Don't worry about trying to make sense of it, and there seems to be something in what you're saying that links up to that, or within, and there's something that's disrupting within that. And that's where the forces of chaos and order, and I don't know, maybe there's something in there that is related. We can't really make sense of it. There's lots of metaphors here, aren't there? And then the metaphors of there being seeds in all this chaos in us. But there are some seeds of goodness there, or positivity. You want to comment?
Because I think that's where, the Buddhist myth, as it were, it goes beyond. So like the story of Ragnarok, it's like it starts the idea of a cycle. Yeah, and so there is this kind of cyclical, and you have Odin, who sees into the nature of things, but it's as if he doesn't see it fully. It's like the Buddha as well. He sees this kind of, yes, there is this cycle, there is this, but somehow he managed, as you said earlier, to pop his head outside of that time, so he could see it from the outside.
Mm.
And so there's this vastness, this timeless, spaceless dimension that, he just experienced. And then he could see back in and see, well, we're just in this cycle. And then he somehow also managed to go in and try to, as you said earlier, he doesn't know if it's possible to convey this. And there's this beautiful book called The Flatland by some Arnold, written over 150 years ago. Really brings out the difficulty of explaining 3 dimensions to someone who only experienced 2 dimensions. If you haven't got, how do you explain vision to someone blind from death? And so the Buddha kind of somehow goes from this timeless dimension to try to, from within time and space, try to, not to explain it, but to show a way to see. And I think that's where the Nordic myth doesn't do. And so that's why it's kind of Odin is Buddha's little brother somehow.
You heard it here, folks. Odin is Buddha's little brother. I'm sure that sentence has never been said before in the history of time. Any response to that, Prasadacarin? You're thinking, man, this guy's weird.
I really agree, and I really appreciate Gunaketu bringing in, because I think that's the kind of I think that's the conversation worth having. Like, what are the kind of advantages of looking at something like Nordic myths, and what are the kind of differences, like Gunaketu kind of pointed to. So I'm really glad he brought that in. I rather have a kind of, I kind of want to link back to what Gunaketu said about kind of the cyclic worldview kind of being more helpful than the linear one, for example. I guess in like talking about the cosmology, but also the kind of pantheon of gods, for example, then in the Nordic mythology, but also like looking at especially later Buddhism and bodhisattvas and Buddhas. So, I think those similarities are really inspiring to me, because Bhante talks about the fact that whether devas and nagas and all these kind of beings, whether they actually exist or not isn't necessarily the relevant question. But Bhante looks back, I think it's in Living with Awareness, he looks back on how the Buddha's world and the people in his time, for them, the world was populated by spirits and gods and so on. And he basically just says, well, it's much better because it's saying that the world is alive rather than dead. I think like that's enough for me to stay open to these kinds of descriptions of the world. Whether they are literally true or not is less important, and I won't base my life on spirits and all the rest of it. But like, it's just an interesting thing, like doing the metabhavana, like what happens if you do the metabhavana thinking of every possible living being without yourself kind of deciding what beings are around. For example, it's just these interesting kind of borders and distinctions that we might make. And following on from that, the kind of whole idea of qualities personifying, I think that for me is really key in comparison. So you have these gods, for example, who someone is carrying the sun over the sky and and whatever. But then you also have these like really kind of moral qualities being embodied and kind of shown. And they are acting in different ways. And I guess that's the similarity for me, with the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, that actually, without the personification, how could I relate to them? It's like compassion isn't enough. but both me and Gunaketu relate to Avalokiteshvara as a force, a person, character, whatever. And I don't know about Gunaketu, but for me, Avalokiteshvara means that I can relate to compassion directly.
It seems what we're all saying really is something about perspective, a much bigger perspective, whether that's in time or outside time, whether it's a bigger perspective on your life quite practically now, or a cosmic perspective of the purpose of our existence, and in what sense we actually do exist at all.
And I think it's very interesting what you say, Prasadacarin, about Avalokiteshvara, and I think as embodiments of these perspectives, because I think this is it's becoming more and more important, this idea of consciousness somehow being, but as you say, Prasadacarin, it's hard to relate to consciousness, and it doesn't really matter, because consciousness, I believe, is always embodied somehow. So it's embodied in us now, here having this conversation. And yes, it is also embodied in Avalokiteshvara somehow. And yes, I have been carrying this, as it were, image of Avalokiteshvara somehow in me, with me, since my ordination a long time ago. And it's kind of manifested in very many ways. And one of the things is this Kuan Yin statue, which at some point lost its head, and so I didn't, I just felt really bad about that, and I thought, no, don't worry, it doesn't feel bad, and there's this sense of waiting for, well, what to do with that, and so later when having this drum made, then it kind of appeared there as a central point. And I think this is another example of how, as you say, letting the quality of enlightenment embody in different ways, so that it could make sense, and it can, and then just being open and play with it and let whatever emerge.
That's a very creative way to use a Buddha head. I'm impressed. Well, we could go on. Actually, this is getting deeper and deeper, but we are within time. We are not outside time today, and I'm sorry to cut this off, but I think it's time we also had a bit of everybody present had a bit of time to talk about these things. And so what we planned was that we would go into threes